Now it's time for everybody's favorite topic, finishing. Now, honestly, that is one of my favorite areas of woodworking. I guess I'm kind of weird. A lot of people really don't like finishing, but it's a challenge. And personally, I get excited about woodworking challenges. So finishing is just one of those things that I like to dive into, experiment with, and just have fun with. The best piece of advice I can give you with finishing is to keep things simple. And in fact, I wrote a small book on that topic, just sort of simplifying the world of finishing and really preparing a new woodworker for what could be a very confusing area of the craft. So if you want, you can check that out. It's in our Wood Whisperer store at twwstore.com. In the meantime, let's talk about the finish for our bench. Now, you can use just about anything, but again, keeping things simple. What I want to do is use polyurethane, but probably a wiping formula. So we're going to dilute some down ourselves, save a few bucks instead of buying the stuff that's pre-diluted. But here's the thing, this particular batch of mahogany, I recall from a previous project, gave me some trouble with the polyurethane drying. Sometimes woods with a high natural oil content will cause an oil-based finish to have difficulty drying. I wasn't really expecting that from mahogany, so I'm not sure why this particular batch gave me that problem, but it's something we have to prepare for. We're going to do that. Where's my can? That's my coffee. We have some shellac here. This is Bullseye SealCoat. Dewaxed shellac. We're going to use that to put a sealer coat on there, and then we'll be able to follow up with the polyurethane finish.
I apply the shellac using a folded up shop towel. Shellac dries really fast, so I try to work quickly. Even though this is just a rough sealing coat, it's not a bad idea to use this time to practice your general application strategy. I try to work one section at a time. Inevitably, you'll get finish on an adjoining piece as you go. That adjoining piece is then the next logical target. In this case, it's the center support. Once the center support is coated, I'll move on to the next leg. From there, it just makes sense to work on the underside of the top, trying to blend in any areas that already have some finish from the legs. Flipping the piece over, I can work on the most visible surface last, the top. I start by blending in the end grain areas. And finally, long smooth strokes give me a nice even application on the top surface.
Now, after about an hour, the shellac is definitely dry enough to sand. And I'm just going to use a high grit wet dry sandpaper. This is about, I think it's about 400 or 500 grit. You really just want to go over the surface lightly and smooth everything out. We're not sanding aggressively here. You don't want to go down to the bare wood. Just smooth everything out. Now, of course, I want to remove that dust before applying my polyurethane, so a lightly dampened rag should do the job. Now, to make my own wiping varnish, I'm just going to use some Minwax fast drying polyurethane. It's a semi-gloss, so I do need to stir it well. But the idea is I want to take this full strength stuff and mix it with some mineral spirits by about 50-50. Okay, so dilute it by about half, and that should give me a decent wiping formula. The mineral spirits thins it enough so that you can use something like a cotton rag to do the wiping. I'm not too picky about this, I just ballpark it. Don't need a lot here. A little mineral spirits. And then stir well. All right, so the goal is to use a little bit of cotton material, fold it up here, and just rub that into the surface. Now, the difference between wiping and using a brush primarily is that you're putting on a very, very thin coat. In fact, a lot of times you're sort of flooding the surface, and then wiping it back to take that excess off. So you're not leaving a whole lot standing on the surface. Right? It takes a lot more coats to build, but the advantage is you don't have any drips, you don't have any brush marks, any kind of sags, none of that stuff to worry about. Right, so just want to rub it into the surface. You have a little bit of working time here. It's not going to set up immediately, but you don't want to be super slow about it either. Right, so I'm just going to move from part to part here, similarly to the way we applied the shellac, from one surface to the next. Flipping this over, of course, the feet are going to get a little bit of a finish on the surface here, but it's not too big of a deal. It's just the feet of this thing. Now, depending on your climate, you may be able to work on this again in about 6 hours. You're going to have to just check the surface. If it's still tacky, just keep waiting. You don't want to put any finish on top of an existing tacky finish. So I'll probably just let this sit overnight. In some climates, especially like mine here in Arizona, I can sometimes get away with 4 to 6 hours between applications. But it's a little later in the day today, so I think I'll wait till tomorrow. Now that this first coat of finish is dry, I can give you the secret to an absolutely perfect finish. Get someone else to do it. All right, just kidding. I don't recommend doing that. I like to do all my own finishing. At this point, if you start to slather on more coats of finish, it's okay, but feel the surface. It's going to be a little bit rough, you know. There's things that settle into the finish as it dries. There's just particles of wood that stay on the surface, so it's probably not going to be smooth enough to just go with the next coat of finish. So here's a little tip, and this is one of the ways that I end up with absolutely glass smooth finishes, and that is sanding between coats. Now, a lot of us know that that's a necessary step. But what you use to sand or abrade the surface in between coats can really make a difference in the final quality. What I like to use are these Festool Platine abrasives. You've probably heard me mention them before. I've got a 1,000 grit pad here. I even have 2,000 and 4,000. So you could use them for various different things in the finishing process. They're meant to go on a sander, but I almost never use them that way. I use them by hand. So on something like this, where you've got a lot of curves, a lot of profiles, if you just use a piece of sandpaper, a lot of times you will sand right through back to the bare wood because we're dealing with very thin finish at this point. But I still want to smooth it out, so something that's padded is perfect. So what I'm going to do is just rub the surface, and it doesn't take much. 3 or 4 strokes on each section is about all it takes to give you a glass smooth surface, and that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to go over the whole thing, and this does create a little bit of dust, but look how good you could be here on the corners. You could really smooth them out. You'll see it'll dust up, it'll chalk up a little bit because the finish is fully dry. But you can smooth over those corners perfectly, and you don't have any detrimental effects. Once again, I'm going to remove the dust with a damp rag. And now with a fresh cloth, we do our second application of finish. Process is exactly the same as the first one. One thing I want you to notice here is even though we're applying a nice thin, even coat, putting too much finger pressure will create streaks in the surface because there's not much material here. So you have 2 choices. Either thicken the pad and then use it that way, so you sort of even out your finger pressure, or just take very, very light strokes as you drag the bundled rags across the surface. All right, and that'll do it. Just got to let it dry. Now you can add as many coats as you want. Just follow that same procedure of sanding in between with 1,000 grit and then adding a nice new thin layer on top. And you could really, you can go as high as 8 or 9 coats if you wanted to, if you're looking to get a substantial build. If you want that substantial of a build, you might consider brushing or go with a slightly more concentrated version. Just don't dilute the poly as much. But I'm actually okay after about 3 coats on this guy. I don't want a really super thick finish. And I think on mahogany, especially because it's an open pored wood, if the finish layer is too thick, it just starts to look a little odd to me. So I like a more natural looking finish. Now, no matter what you do, this last coat, yeah, it may be pretty darn smooth. Some people may even be happy with the way it is right now. But run your fingers across it, and if you still feel little dust nibs, there is one more trick that you can do, and I highly recommend you do this on just about any finish, and it's something I like to call finishing the finish. In the woodworking literature, this is referred to as rubbing out the finish, and there's so many different ways that you could pull this off, but this is just one that I really like to use on oil-based finishes, and in fact, it's something that I learned from my good buddy, William Ng. And it really just involves using your standard mineral oil. Okay, you want a non-drying oil here, something that allows you to have plenty of working time. Put it in a dish, and then add some mineral spirits just to dilute it down. All right, this mixture is going to serve as a lubricant as we abrade the surface. We don't really want to change the sheen of the surface, we just want to make sure it's nice and smooth. So I'm going to mix this around. And now I have a 2000 grit abrasive pad instead of the 1000. Just going to dip that into the mineral spirits, mineral oil solution, and lightly rub down the surface. Now, the 2000 is actually a high enough grit that it's really not going to change our semi-gloss sheen here, because ultimately we don't want to change it, we just want to smooth things out. I'm using a very light touch too, especially on these corners and curves here. You do want to be careful. Now, as an alternative, you could certainly use like a Scotch-Brite pad or something like that, or even steel wool, but you may want to just kind of practice in an inconspicuous area so you could be prepared for what that might do to the sheen. But I find these platine abrasives are just fantastic for this type of thing. All right, now I just grab a paper towel and wipe off as much of that mineral oil mixture as I can. Now remember that mineral oil really is never going to cure, it's never going to dry. So we have to get as much as we can off of the surface, otherwise the surface will be oily. And then I like to take a clean paper towel and a little bit of plain old mineral spirits here, and that should help to pick up the remaining residual mineral oil that might be left on the surface. After giving the mineral spirits a few minutes to dry off, I just grab a nice clean towel and give it one last rub down. Now, if you follow these steps, I personally guarantee that this will be one of the silkiest, smoothest finishes you have ever produced. And I know for shop woodworkers, home shop woodworkers like us, it's very difficult to get an absolutely perfect finish because we don't have spray booths and there's usually dust in the air. Everything about our finishing environment is not perfect. So getting that final finish to be absolutely glass smooth and silky can be pretty challenging, but hopefully you see it doesn't have to be. If you have the right materials and you know exactly what to do, a simple one-step procedure like that at the very end of the project, it absolutely transforms it into perfection. All right, the key is really a lubricant and some sort of abrasive. These foam pads I think are fantastic. Festool isn't the only one who makes them though. Mirka also makes some similar pads that you could use for this. You don't have to use mineral oil. You can actually just use mineral spirits alone. You could use water or maybe even just a little bit of dish soap in that water. And depending on the type of finish you're abrading, whether it's shellac or lacquer, of course water-based finishes, you may want to vary the lubricant that you use. Either way, the whole point is to limit the friction and give you a nice, silky smooth finish with very little effort. And here's the thing, it's not like I used an expensive polyurethane. This is just Minwax poly right off the shelf, diluted down and produces a finish of this caliber. So hopefully you'll see that finishing does not have to be complicated and we don't need the perfect environment or the perfect woodworker to get results like this. We're all capable of doing something like this. So now, the only thing left to do is to take this beauty home, show it to Nicole, show it to Mateo, and see what the family thinks about it, because really I built it for them, so let's head back to the house. Now before I unleash the boy on these things, I just wanted to take a minute to compare the differences and show you some of the things that we changed between the old version and the two new versions. Very subtle differences, but I think it's little refinements like that that can take a project from a beginning stage prototype to something that's a little bit more refined and elegant. So let's take a closer look. One of the more noticeable changes is in the legs. Down here at the bottom on the old version, I had a little bit more of just a standard semicircle that I wasn't really happy with. I felt it was a little bit too high and a little bit too geometric, for lack of a better phrase there. So I went with something that's a little bit more of a subtle lift, and I also was careful to remove extra material right in this area to give it an inward dip. And what that really does is when you approach it from this sort of angle, it just gives it a little bit more of a curved effect. Even though this piece really doesn't have any curvature from one side to the other, this sort of induces a visual curve that almost fools the eye. As you look down upon it, it just looks like it's curved, right? So, and that's just a little bit of clever material removal, if you will. Whereas on this one, we don't really have that. We just have the lift, and then the two parts of the leg touch down on the surface there. So that's one big change. Another change is very subtle, but it's with regard to the actual shape of the top. This is a perfect rectangle, right? All of these edges are nice and straight. On this version, the new version, I put a nice little curve right here on the end. It's so subtle, you know, it's something you might not even notice at first, but when you see the two next to each other, you can see that it does make a little bit of a difference there. And sometimes it's those subtle little things that people don't notice at first glance that really make a piece special. Now the final thing is right here at the bottom, this extra little curve we threw in there. I just removed some extra material. On the old version, it really just is square, and we did a round over profile treatment here. But by removing a little bit of extra material there and sloping it up gently, what that does is give the impression that this entire seat is curved on the bottom, even though we know it's perfectly flat. So once again, just a nice little subtle change. So I've got the whole family here to test out the new Sitting Bench Step Stool, whatever you want to call it. I think Mateo approves, right? Yeah. It's good, buddy? Yeah, it's good. So what I wanted to mention is if you are going to have a little one using this, you might want to rethink the strategy that I employed to smooth the surface. This is so slippery and slick that think about a little one with a foot with a sock on it could very easily just go flying. So you may want to have something that's a little bit more textured, maybe not as much of a film finish, not quite as smooth, just for safety's sake. But we plan on using ours for kitchen step stool. I think it'll be great for him when he gets older. Maybe I'll have to rough up the top a little bit when we do that so he can brush his teeth and wash his little hands.
I'll be using it.
Yeah, for baths, right?
For baths, yeah.
Right now we have him in a little whale-shaped tub that he gets washed in, and it's kind of hard to lean over, so this low seat is perfect for sitting there and giving him his bath. And I know your mom puts it in the kitchen. My mom's going to put hers in the kitchen because my mom's short. So, yeah. So it'll be a pretty cool utilitarian bench, sitting bench step stool, however you want to use it. And you know what? You know what else would be great for?
What?
A timeout bench.
Ooh.
Right?
Oh, yes.
Right? For when you're a bad little boy. That's never going to happen, is it? No, it's not. Yeah. It will happen. It's only a matter of time. Get on your timeout stool, son. All right.
Multi-purpose.
Yeah.
Multi-purpose.
Absolutely. So hopefully you have enough information here to build something similar. Use this as a starting point for inspiration and build a similar project. And hopefully you have an awesome recipient for the project as well. Yeah! I think he's pooping. Are you pooping?
Good thing we got a good finish on it.
Yeah, no kidding. Here's your close-up. Okay.